I grew up in Granby, Connecticut, and we had a wonderful elementary school. It was 4 grades in one room and 4 in the other, and we walked home for lunch. And in our little school, the writers wrote and the artists painted. And I remember the walls were covered with brown paper much of the time so that the artists could do their work. And it was exactly what we all needed.
Oh, great.
I wrote a weekly column for the York County Coast-Star called Herb of Grace, More Than a Maine Parsonage. And I could sit at our kitchen table with the family tumbling around me. It all was right there, and a matter of putting it down.
Yeah.
I used to use my Christmas poem, and I wrote one every year, and the family would get anxious and say, "Is it done yet?" And I was wondering the same thing. And eventually I made that into a collection called Angel Audacities. And after that, a friend who's very dear to me and does calligraphy did them on nice paper in her lovely calligraphy. And then our niece Gretchen Hatfield, who is a fine artist, drew angels. And an illustration improves the text a great deal. I've always been happy to be with visual artists, and they help my process along. Like if I see a color and I relate, I think primary colors, the greens and blues and reds, to colors that I saw in my childhood, and I've never been able to find out what they came from. We had clear glass in our church, so I wasn't brought up with stained glass. It was stained glass at the seminary library. I'm very deeply moved by stained glass. And color, bright colors, sort of like an interested crow. Collaboration with another artist, Alicia Nethery, who was born in Spain and met her husband when he was there in the diplomatic service. And they retired to Kennebunkport. And she was in Maine Women in the Arts for a while, and approached me about writing poems for her work. I would go up and have lunch with Alicia, but I'd go in the morning and sit beside her and look at the work, and she would talk to me about it. And she had a lovely Spanish accent, and I sat there scribbling, and often I wrote down things that were actually better than Alicia had said. I was going through a couple of filters of minds, and I loved working with her. Martin Dibner, the novelist, was wonderful to me. And I took a course from him, a night course, and that was wonderful. And he always gave a couple of big parties, and we would go to his house in Casco. And he was a wonderful influence, not his writing, but his being. And he took my Herb of Grace manuscript to Doubleday, which is his publisher. And of course, hope soared. And it came back, and that really caused a depression. But he was a delight. And through Martin, I met a friend of his, Susanna Swihart, who lived, she's not alive now, but she lived in a huge farmhouse on Casco Lake. And I would go up and have lunch with Susanna, Bob, and I, and just talk. And I'd read poems to her. Susanna meant a great deal. And then Martin died, and I would go to Susanna, and from her kitchen window, she could see the cemetery with her husband's grave and Martin's. And, you know, I'm still working on a poem for that. And in terms of music, I love doing that. We had an organist at South Church in Kennebunkport who was a composer. And one Advent he called me and said he was going to write an opera for Christmas. And if he did the music, would I do the words? And I was thrilled. And so he would bring me, you know, the scores. He was developing it. And I would play it on the piano and think about it, and then the words came. And it was very easy. And then, this isn't sequential, but Angela LeBlanc, who sang with the Choral Arts Society in Portland, called me and said that Dan Locklear, a composer at Wake Forest University, had been commissioned to write music for the Choral Arts Society, and he was asking for poems. And of course I was thrilled, and I said I'd love to, and I didn't do anything. And one day Angela appeared at my door and held out her hand and said, "Give me a poem." And so I gave her, I gave her AMH. And then after that I did one or two other pieces for Dan Locklear. And I've been interested in the Japanese verse forms. And I've worked with children in the schools who were interested in writing. And so I worked with, I guess I was working with Annalise Gauss Todrank at Consolidated in Kennebunkport, and a boy at Park Street in Kennebunk. And so we began doing linked verse, and Annalise would write something, and then I'd bring it to Jason, and he'd write something, and then I would, and so we had a round robin going. And I loved that. And I spent 20 years writing the Welsh poems. My father planned to write his autobiography, and he was still in Connecticut, and I encouraged him to send me work. And it was clear that his mind was not what it had been. And so over the year, well, when they were with us, I went through his books, and his books were crammed with clippings. And some of them went back to the First World War, and I think one to 1910. And the small print and the casualty lists of the First World War, just pages. And I went through all of the clippings, and I had his sermons, which he taught himself shorthand, and he couldn't read it then either, and I never could. And so I would read the sermons and piece them together. And it took a long time, but then the poems began coming. I don't feel that being in Maine has permeated me. I mean, I love Maine, but I think my roots were formed in Granby. And I give Bob a lot of credit. He's part of it too. And I appreciate, the glories of Maine, but it hasn't influenced my writing. Years ago, there was a wonderful bookstore in Kennebunkport, the Kennebunk Bookport, and I did a poetry reading there one afternoon, and the interviewer at that time asked me to list, in order of importance, what, loomed high in my life. And I found myself writing poems, and then I think I threw in my children and my husband, but they took it in good stride. I'd rather do it than anything else.